Trust Wallet had a security incident. Funds were affected. Compensation mechanisms were activated. Nothing unusual. If you've been around markets long enough, incidents happen, systems respond, life moves on. But almost immediately, the same conclusion surfaced again. Not quietly, not cautiously, firm, confident, final. If this can happen, crypto custody isn't safe. Not just this wallet, not this implementation, not this specific setup, crypto itself. That jump from a single incident to an entire system didn't come from new information. It came from familiarity, from a pattern people already expect to see. When something breaks, the mind doesn't pause to ask where the failure lives. It looks for a category large enough to contain the discomfort. And the larger the category, the faster certainty returns. This episode isn't about what happened, it's about how quickly meaning was assigned, before structure was even considered. This is where misinterpretation usually begins. Not at the incident itself, but at the moment it gets promoted. A localized failure is uncomfortable because it doesn't explain much. It doesn't tell a story. It doesn't give closure. So the mind does something efficient. It upgrades the incident into a system-level verdict. If one thing failed, then the whole thing must be fragile. If damage occurred here, then danger must exist everywhere. This isn't analysis, it's compression. Complex systems feel safer when they're flattened. Layers disappear, boundaries blur. What was once a specific breakdown becomes a universal warning, not because the evidence demands it, but because ambiguity feels worse than being wrong. That's why these conclusions spread so easily. They don't require understanding, they only require recognition. I've seen this before. This always ends the same way. The speed of that recognition feels like insight. But speed isn't accuracy. It's just relief. What failed here wasn't cryptography, not blockchain architecture, not the protocol layer. Those words get mentioned often, but they weren't where the break occurred. The failure lived elsewhere, in implementation, in operational setup, in a specific execution path that existed at the edges, not at the core. That distinction matters more than most people realize, but it's rarely where attention goes. Because when something breaks, people don't look for structure. They look for certainty. And certainty doesn't come from precision. It comes from blame. Blame collapses distance. It removes layers. It turns "this part failed" into "this can't be trusted." The system didn't dissolve. Its boundaries were simply ignored. And once boundaries disappear, everything starts to feel equally unsafe, even when the failure never touched the foundation at all. There's a reason these conclusions feel so convincing. When something breaks, uncertainty appears before understanding, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. It asks for patience. It demands distance. So the mind reaches for something faster, certainty. Certainty doesn't need layers. It doesn't need timelines. It doesn't ask where a failure actually occurred. It just needs a label big enough to make the discomfort stop. Unsafe, broken, can't be trusted. Those words don't describe structure, they describe relief. Relief from not knowing, relief from waiting, relief from having to hold complexity a little longer. That's why these moments rarely slow people down. They accelerate them. The moment uncertainty shows up, meaning rushes in to fill the space. Not because it's accurate, but because it's immediate. And immediacy often feels like clarity, even when nothing has actually become clearer. The same pattern appeared again with Polymarket. Users lost funds. The reaction was instant. DeFi isn't safe. Protocols can't be trusted. The phrasing felt familiar, almost rehearsed. But once again, the failure didn't originate from the protocol itself. It came from a third-party flaw, an external layer, an execution issue that lived outside the core system. Different incident, different cause, identical conclusion. That similarity matters, because it shows the conclusion wasn't built from the details of the event. It was applied to the event. The incident didn't create the interpretation. The interpretation was already waiting. All it needed was a trigger. That's how misreading travels so efficiently. It doesn't adapt to context. It overlays itself onto whatever happens next. The moment something goes wrong, the verdict arrives fully formed. Not because the system failed, but because the shortcut was already there. Most failures don't happen at the center. They happen at the edges, operational layers, third-party integrations, human execution. These are the parts designed to change, to connect, to adapt. They're also the parts most likely to break. But when edge failures are read as core flaws, something subtle happens. Structure disappears. The difference between design and deployment vanishes, between architecture and usage, between what a system is and how it's interacted with. And once that distinction is gone, everything feels equally fragile. Fear expands faster than facts, because facts live in layers. Fear doesn't. Fear only needs one question. What if this applies to everything? That question doesn't wait for answers. It spreads on its own. And by the time structure is revisited, meaning has already settled. Not because it was correct, but because it arrived first. This is how signals start to distort, not because the information is false, but because it's read faster than the structure beneath it. A headline appears, a metric moves, an incident happens, and before pressure forms, before behavior actually shifts, a conclusion is already in place. The signal isn't allowed to remain incomplete. It's forced to mean something. Risk on, risk off, confidence lost, trust broken. But many signals don't arrive finished. They arrive early. They sit in a space where nothing is being forced yet. No liquidation, no cascade, no collective decision. Just activity without obligation. That space is uncomfortable because it doesn't reward decisiveness. So interpretation speeds up to compensate. The faster the meaning is assigned, the less time structure has to speak. And once meaning settles, it rarely gets revisited, even if the pressure never shows up. Uncertainty often gets treated like weakness, like something is missing, like a decision hasn't arrived yet because something went wrong. But uncertainty isn't a breakdown. It's a pause before commitment. Capital waits, behavior hesitates, systems remain intact. Nothing is being forced, yet the absence of motion gets read as a signal itself, a sign that confidence is gone, that conviction has evaporated. But waiting isn't the same as exiting, and hesitation isn't the same as fear. Sometimes it's just the system not being pushed into action yet. That distinction matters, because when uncertainty is misread as failure, every delay feels dangerous. And when every delay feels dangerous, interpretation turns aggressive. Meaning is no longer observed. It's imposed. Not because the system demanded it, but because the observer couldn't tolerate the gap. Not every problem is a signal. Some are just friction inside a system that hasn't been forced to decide. Markets don't test prediction first, they test interpretation. They test how quickly meaning is assigned when structure is still intact. They test whether observers can sit with uncertainty without turning it into a verdict. Most misreadings don't come from bad information. They come from the urge to resolve discomfort too quickly. That's the real pressure point. Not whether something happened, but how fast it was made to mean everything. Because once interpretation hardens, behavior follows. And by then, The system hasn't failed. Understanding has.